I've treated hundreds of patients and trained thousands of healthcare professionals over my 15-year career. And one thing I've learned through that experience is that most people are really confused about supplements, or they lack a clear strategy or plan for how to use supplements to improve their health. That's why I created Adapt Naturals. It's a supplement line designed to add back in what the modern world has squeezed out and help you feel and perform your best. Our ancestors' diets were rich in the essential vitamins and minerals and phytonutrients we need for optimal function. But today, thanks to declining soil quality, a growing toxic burden, and other challenges in the modern world, most of us are not getting enough of these critical nutrients. I formulated Adapt Naturals using the principles of evolutionary biology and modern research to fill the nutrient gaps that we face today and replicate the nutrient intakes found in an optimal ancestral diet. Our flagship offering is called the Core Plus Bundle, a daily stack of 5 products that gives you everything you need each day, from essential vitamins and minerals like B12, folate, magnesium, and vitamin D, to phytonutrients like bioflavonoids, carotenoids, and beta-glucans. You can also order the products in the bundle separately if that works better for your needs. The Adapt Naturals products are made from the highest quality, food-based, or bioidentical ingredients. From cellular and immune health to brain and nervous system support to blood sugar and heart health, we've got you covered. Your supplement cupboard is about to get a lot smaller. We also created an app called Core Reset to help you get your nutrition, sleep, movement, and stress management dialed in. Because no matter how good our supplements are, and they are really good, you can't supplement yourself out of a bad diet and lifestyle. The best part is that you get this app at no additional cost when you order the Core Plus bundle. Head over to adaptnaturals.com, that's ADAPT naturals.com, to learn more and start feeling and performing your best. Hey everybody, Chris Kresser here. Welcome to another episode of Revolution Health Radio. Many of you have probably heard of the EAT-Lancet planetary health diet. This made a big splash when this paper was published. The idea was the researchers tried to come up with a diet that is good for individual humans and good for the planet and is sustainable, will be sustainable over time. But it turns out that this diet approach that they proposed, which was heavily plant-based, lots of grains and legumes and very few animal products, fell short of some critical micronutrients that most people don't get enough of already, and could potentially deepen and exacerbate those micronutrient deficiencies. So I invited Ty Beal on the show to discuss this. Ty's a global nutrition scientist. He's a research advisor on the knowledge leadership team at Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, or GAIN, where he generates evidence to guide programs and mobilize knowledge related to global nutrition and food systems. And he has a PhD from UC Davis, where he was National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellow. And he and his colleagues published a critique of the EAT-Lancet planetary health diet and highlighted what the micronutrient deficiencies would be if you were to follow that diet, and why that is a problem in a world where those nutrient deficiencies are already prevalent, not only in the developing world, but even in rich industrialized countries like the US and Canada. So in this show, I dig into the paper that Ty just published. We talk about what the planetary health diet is, which micronutrients are lacking, and what can be done, if anything, to shore that up. What Ty's recommendations would be for a truly nutrient-dense and nutritionally sustainable diet for most of us. And we talk a little bit about some of the responses that he's had from his paper from the authors of the EAT-Lancet planetary health diet, like Walter Willett and also David Katz. So this was a fascinating discussion. As you know, if you've been listening to this show for any length of time, I'm really passionate about nutrient deficiency and nutrient density, and how we can improve our micronutrient status, and why that is the rising tide that lifts all boats, and can help us to achieve almost all of our health goals, at least to some extent. So this was a really important interview for me, and really important topic. So I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Let's dive in. Ty Beal, welcome back on the show. Pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
So I think a lot of people have heard of the EAT-Lancet planetary health diet, from this show, listeners of this show, or people who followed my work or yours. But for those that are completely unfamiliar with this concept, why don't you just start by defining what that is?
Sure. So, a planetary health diet, in the context of the EAT-Lancet report, was really trying to design a diet that can meet the needs of the global human population now and in the future, as well as stay within planetary boundaries. So, a way to think of that is like a healthy and sustainable diet.
Healthy for us, healthy for the planet. That's the promise, right?
Exactly.
And what would you say about how this diet has been received overall, like in the mainstream media and, just from what you've seen on Twitter and social media and the kind of general reception of EAT-Lancet?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two camps. I think it's highly praised by a lot of media as sort of the solution that we need to be working towards. Especially by environmentalists, I would say. And there's also been a fair amount of pushback, certainly on social media as well. A little bit less so on mainstream media, but social media has been full of people pushing back on the sort of limits on animal source foods, questioning the nutrient adequacy of the diet. And so we really see some polarized responses to the report.
So I recently had Rid Shin and Lynn Pledger on to talk about more the ecological, environmental, and sustainability aspects of an animal-based diet and why animals might actually be necessary in our food system and ecosystem. So I'm going to not focus on that in this conversation, especially because you have published a paper that is specifically about some concerns that you have about the micronutrients lacking in the planetary health diet. And this is an interest that you and I both share, just overall, nutrient status and nutrient density and the importance of that for our health and well-being. And you've done a lot of phenomenal work on this subject before. And for listeners who haven't heard my previous interviews with Ty, you should definitely check those out, because we talk about another paper that I think was from March of about a year ago, right, Ty? March 2022, the Frontiers of Nutrition paper.
Yeah, exactly. That was last year, same time.
Last year, where you and your colleagues published the nutrient density ratings of foods. And I believe it was the first paper to take bioavailability fully into account. And from that, we learned how important animal foods can be in the diet from a nutrient density perspective. So tell us a little bit about the EAT-Lancet planetary health diet from a micronutrient perspective and what some of the concerns that you have are.
Sure. So I'll just start by saying I was actually asked by an editor of a journal about the adequacy of, because they had some concerns, and I think some people had reached out to them. So it was not just me who was sort of questioning the adequacy. I think there were some others, but really, I think for me, I have done enough work on modeling global diets, nutrient density, nutrient adequacy, as well as actual deficiencies in people when you look at their levels of these biomarkers in the body. So I had concern because I knew the lower you get with animal source foods, the more challenging it can be to meet your needs, especially for nutrients like iron and zinc, which they exist in plant source foods, but they're quite a bit less bioavailable. And there are some questions, on the EAT-Lancet diet, which we don't have to get into sort of the debate about how protective that is of non-communicable disease, but it's a minimally processed plant-based diet. I don't have a lot of concerns there. It's really more on the adequacy side, where it's very high in whole grains and legumes, which minimally processed can be part of healthy diets, but it was concerning because they're very high in phytate, and I don't think maybe many people don't realize this, but it's sort of off the charts of phytate in terms of how we look at recommended intakes for zinc, for example, where you have these categories of an unrefined diet, which would be about 1,200 milligrams of phytate. There's a lower bioavailability of zinc. This affects iron as well, but what we saw is that, wow, the phytate on this diet is actually closer to 2,000 and even close to 2,500 milligrams. So its impact on bioavailability really isn't well understood.
So can I just interrupt there just for the listeners who are not aware of what phytate is, and also known as phytic acid? Can you tell folks a little bit about why that's a concern from a micronutrient perspective?
Yeah, so phytate binds to minerals like iron, zinc, calcium, and it really inhibits their absorption. So the higher the phytate in the diet, the lower the bioavailability of those minerals. And so that's why, in particular, I was concerned about recognizing that when you have a lot of phytate in the diet, you actually have to consume a lot more iron and zinc. And many people don't realize that, right? It's just, oh, you just have a set amount of iron that you need and a set amount of zinc. But it actually depends on what your total diet is and the bioavailability. And the other factor, which I didn't mention, is that heme iron is really much more bioavailable, and heme iron is only found in animal source foods. And so you have this sort of difference in the bioavailability from the type of iron, as well as the amount of phytate and other anti-nutrients that can prevent that absorption or hinder the absorption.
Yeah, so this is something that I've wrote about in my first book, Paleo Cure, way back in 2013, 10 years ago now, and my belief has always been that whole grains and legumes, especially when they're properly prepared, some of the traditional methods of preparing grains and legumes, which most cultures did prior to the Industrial Revolution, and still many cultures do, like particularly soaking them with some acidic substance like yogurt or kefir or lemon juice or something like that, can break down some of the phytic acid. And there's been some interesting research on this and makes the nutrients more bioavailable. But I think it's pretty safe to say that in many situations, grains and legumes are being consumed without those traditional methods of preparation in our culture today, in most places in the modern industrial world. And so if you're building your entire food pyramid, if you will, your entire diet around these foods, which can be okay in moderation, but if they're replacing other more nutrient dense food, that's where the problem and the concern comes. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think it's a question of balance. And like you said, most people are not preparing their grains and legumes. And we know that because we're using food composition data from foods in the form that they're typically consumed, right? So in their typically consumed form, they have a certain amount of phytate. Now, we know, of course, like you said, you can ferment, you can germinate, you can soak grains, legumes, seeds, etc., to reduce phytate, but that's not being done in the majority of these foods around the world.
Yeah, I mean, I've tried to get patients to do this for many years, and I would say just a small handful actually would do it, and it's a lot of work. And that might actually fit in with a more traditional lifestyle where there's shared resources and people are doing those kinds of things together, and it's just part of a normal daily routine. But it's not really part of the way that, or built into the modern way of living for most people.
I have seen, yeah, I agree with that, but I have seen more and more products, at least in the US, where they come as like a sprouted grain. For example, sprouted quinoa. I see that commonly, sprouted oatmeal. Even Costco has these products, at least the sprouted oatmeal. So I think there could be a movement towards that. I think that's one potential way to sort of improve the bioavailability, and I certainly think it's worth pursuing. I've also seen sprouted lentils and mung beans, things like that. But I think you're right that most consumers are not going to be purchasing those products at this point.
Yeah, we're talking about a very small minority, but I'm glad you brought that up because they're particularly at health food stores like Whole Foods, natural grocers, et cetera, and even like you said, in Costco and some other more mainstream stores, you can find some sprouted varieties, and they are a much better choice from a nutrient density perspective. So what you mentioned, zinc and iron as two of the main nutrients of concern, and because they're minerals that are bound by phytate. Are there other nutrients that you're concerned about on the planetary health diet?
Yeah, in this recent study, we also found shortfalls for calcium and vitamin B12. Now, they weren't as large as for iron and zinc, but I do think there's a concern there, especially when you think of populations consuming low amounts of animal source foods.
And why do you think it is that this was this quantified in the paper that was published on planetary health diet? I mean, the whole premise was a diet that's healthy for humans and healthy for the planet. So Was it that they didn't take micronutrient density into account as one of the health factors, or was it they weren't considering bioavailability and the impact of phytate? In other words, is your concern just a lack of the amount of that nutrient on paper, like the RDA, or presence of phytic acid that would interfere with the absorption of those nutrients, or both?
I think it's a combination. So the lead author is Walter Willett. I think he's probably the world's leading expert on nutrition or nutrition epidemiology. And so his perspective is sort of the recommended nutrient intakes are not really appropriate. You should either use nutrient density, per calorie, because people need different energy requirements, or they're not necessarily applicable, because he's looking at sort of health outcomes of these intakes of different levels. So I sort of disagree, but I think his point is just there's a disagreement about how much of these nutrients do we need. And I think a big one for that he would highlight, I mean, he and David Ludwig published a review in the New England Journal of Medicine on dairy and calcium. And that suggests that people don't need as much calcium as are sort of suggested in the recommended nutrient intakes. Now, I'm sort of agnostic to that, whatever, but I've worked with micronutrients enough to know that the data, it all kind of suggests the same thing. The food supply data says there's not high enough nutrient density in the food supply. The dietary intake data, when we survey people, what did you eat in the last 24 hours? There's not enough micronutrients in their diet. And the biomarkers, when you actually measure in people's bodies, there are widespread micronutrient deficiencies. So for me, I think it's a pretty significant burden worldwide. And I think the question then can sort of become, well, what is the real health burden from this? What's the morbidity and the mortality? And that's, I think, a reasonable debate. But for me, it's an important issue to focus on. I think when you look at the original adequacy assessment for the EAT-Lancet planetary health diet, it used the other issue is that it used different recommended nutrient intakes that were dated, so they weren't the latest evidence. And we also had an update in 2020 where there was sort of a paper out by Lindsay Allen and others that said, let's try to agree on a harmonized set of recommended nutrient intakes. Because if you look into nutrient intakes, many countries or regions of the world have different recommendations. So you have the EFSA in Europe, the European Food Safety Authority. You have the Institute of Medicine in the US, and then you have others in other countries, and many of them are saying different things and sort of different justifications. So I think I would acknowledge there's some uncertainty around what levels of these nutrients should we consume. But I think you would probably agree with this. Many of these are not necessarily based on optimal consumption. So even if you do meet the target for a nutrient, it may actually be beneficial to consume above that for many different reasons. Now, I think you can see an argument on the other side where people say, well, there's also a risk of consuming too much. People may say that about iron, and I've heard that. So I think there's some things that are open to debate, but from my perspective, we looked at things as objectively as we could, trying to use the latest evidence on bioavailability, trying to be pretty fair. We assumed a 10% bioavailability of iron on the EAT-Lancet diet, which I think is pretty generous considering how much phytate is in there. But there are some animal source foods, and there's quite a bit of vitamin C. So we wanted to be fair, and we still find shortfalls. And so I think it comes down to sort of probably the biggest factor is sort of a disagreement about what are the recommended intakes, and that I think there's some disagreement about.
Yeah, I want to linger here for a little bit because I'm very concerned with the idea of downwardly revising the recommended nutrient intakes rather than increasing them, which I think is what the majority of research suggests we should be doing. There are so many reasons for this, and I don't think, one of the problems that I see is that there's a lot of research in different areas that points to the need for increasing, I think, in many cases, the recommended intake of these nutrients, but there isn't a central sort of source, like to your point, of harmonized recommendations that's pulling all of these different lines of evidence together. So an example would be, we know that chronic disease affects nutrient needs in two ways. It increases the demand for nutrients because chronic disease is a stressor on the body, and it decreases in many cases the absorption of nutrients. For example, we know that people who with obesity and metabolic issues they convert less sunlight into vitamin D in response to sun exposure than someone who's lean and metabolically healthy. And we also know that they absorb less vitamin D from both food and supplements, such that if you look at the scientific research, you can see that the recommended dose for maintaining adequate serum vitamin D levels for someone who's obese with metabolic disease is often 5 to 10,000 IU versus, maybe 1,000 to 2,000 IU for someone who doesn't have those conditions. We also have an increase in environmental toxins that bind to minerals and other nutrients and interfere with their absorption. There's a lot of papers on that. We have an increasingly industrial food system where food is shipped for 3,000 or 4,000 miles before it's consumed, and it's losing nutritional value throughout that journey and that process. So, and then we have the presence of anti-nutrients, like you've mentioned with phytic acid, but there are others that can interfere with nutrient absorption, such that if you were to just look at diet surveys and the amount of nutrients that people are consuming on paper, you know better than anyone that that's not the ultimate amount that we're actually absorbing and using. And as a clinician who has literally tested every single person who's walked through my door for 15 years for nutrient status, I can honestly say that there's been only a small handful of people who didn't have at least one and not multiple nutrient deficiencies, as evidenced by their biomarkers and their food intake, assessing their food intake with something like Chronometer or a similar tool. And these are people who are highly, my patients are not the average population. They're people who are highly motivated. They've typically, been listening to blogs and podcasts like mine for a long time. They're not eating a standard American diet. They're shopping at health food stores and eating a relatively good diet. And it's still an issue for those people. So I get really nervous when I hear the idea that, we don't have to worry about it. And maybe we need fewer nutrients than the RDA has established, especially because in many cases, the RDA has not been updated for 20 or even 30 years. And the formula for the RDA is often based on things like average body weight. And average body weight has gone up hugely in the past 25 or 30 years alone. So yeah, I'm just curious about your take on that, because this is your really your area of expertise and study, and you're aware of all these different lines of evidence and different factors that affect nutrient density.
Yeah, Chris, I think you're absolutely right about all of that. I fully agree. And I don't have any question that the risk of inadequacy is much higher than any risk of harm from excess nutrient intake. You look at the data, the nutrient density of our diets is not great, and you look back to traditional cultures, or our ancestors. They had much higher nutrient densities than we consume now, and there are other concerns. Climate change, as more carbon comes into the atmosphere, there's actually going to be a reduction in the iron and zinc and other minerals in our crops. So the very crops that are going to be supplying these plant-rich diets, grains, staple foods, there's going to be less iron and zinc and protein in these foods. So we have to pay attention to this. We need to increase the nutrient density of foods. I fully agree about that. So I think that the concern about, the question maybe of, well, what exactly do people need? Well, what do we need to avoid, the specific effects of some disease from a deficiency? That's a different question than what's optimal. And you talked about vitamin D. We looked at prevalence of vitamin D deficiency using a very sort of low bar of the 25-OHD, and that's not optimal, right? I think there is a case where 50 or higher would be optimal for when you look at other markers, right? And we're just looking at sort of this very low bar, and we find widespread deficiency. So I think I am concerned, just as you are, You mentioned your patients. Well, we looked at people in the US, the UK, all around the world, and we found this is a study that came out last fall. We found actually very high prevalence of deficiency all over the place. So worldwide, 2 in 3 women aged 15 to 49 had at least one micronutrient deficiency. And that wasn't even looking at all of the nutrients. You know, there are 25 essential micronutrients. We were looking at 3 or 4. Some countries, in India and Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, others, it's 9 in 10 women. So it's not a small issue. Even in the U.S., over 20% of women in that age group are deficient in iron. In the UK, it's similar, and also in the UK, you see folate and vitamin D deficiency around 20%. So I agree. I think this is an underappreciated issue, and it's something that requires attention.
Hmm. Yeah, and again, even those deficiency statistics are using benchmarks which themselves might be out of date or too low, right? So, I mean, an example that I've used recently is with magnesium. So, the current RDA for magnesium is 320 for women and 420 for men, but those RDAs were last published in 1997 using average body weights of 133 pounds for women and 166 pounds for men. But today, the average body weight is 169 pounds for women and 196 pounds for men. And so some researchers published a study in 2021 where they recalculated the RDAs for magnesium to reflect that increased average body weight in the US population. And they came up with a new adjusted RDA for women of 467 to 534 milligrams per day. That's a huge difference. That goes from 320 to up to 534. That's 200 milligrams per day more that a woman would need, and the male level was 575 to almost 660. So again, another 200-point increase. Then you look
Chris,
at the average.
We just consume an extra 1,000 calories to keep you
to compensate, right?
To compensate, right?
Yeah, but the problem is, as you well know, those extra 1,000 calories of cheese doodles and big gulps and highly processed and refined foods don't contain any nutrients to speak of. So the average intake of magnesium for U.S. adults is currently 340 to 344 milligrams for men and 256 to 273 milligrams for women. So women are falling short already of the inadequate RDA that was published in 1997. But if we were to use these updated RDAs based on the actual current average body weights today, the typical person is falling short 200 to 300 milligrams per day less magnesium. So, that's just one example. Like there's papers that suggest the RDA for B12 should be 300 to 500% higher in order to reliably avoid signs and symptoms of B12 deficiency. There's been arguments that the RDA for vitamin D, which is currently only 600 IU, should be at least 1,000 IU per day, if not higher. Linus Pauling Institute has argued that the RDA for vitamin C should be increased by 200%. So, there's other things I want to talk about, but I just couldn't let that go because you and I think just both know too much to be able to accept the proposition that, hey, the RDAs are not only fine, maybe they're too high, and we should just be satisfied with people not even meeting the RDA. I think that's a really dangerous argument. If you've listened to this show for a while, you know that I'm a super active guy. Depending on the time of year, I'm either skiing, mountain biking, hiking, backpacking, surfing, or lifting weights on most days of the week. I also live in a really dry climate at high elevation. For these reasons, I pay a lot of attention to hydration. I've learned the hard way what happens when I get dehydrated, and I know how important hydration is to overall health. But hydration isn't just about drinking water. It's about water plus electrolytes. This is where Element comes in. It's a combination of electrolytes like sodium, potassium, and magnesium in easy-to-use individual packets that you just add right to your water bottle. And unlike most electrolyte products on the market, Element is free of sugar and artificial junk. I drink Element every day, and it's made a huge difference in how I feel. Even with my training and profession, I don't think I realized how often I was dehydrated before I made Element part of my daily routine. If you'd like to try it, the folks at Element have an exclusive offer for my podcast listeners. You can get a free sample pack with one of each of the 8 flavors Element sells when you purchase any Element product. This is perfect for anyone who wants to try all of the flavors or who wants to introduce a friend to Element. Just go to kresser.co/element, that's LMNT, to place an order and take advantage of this offer. Vitamin C is a critical nutrient for immune function and antioxidant protection. Yet most people don't get enough in their diet, and most vitamin C supplements contain synthetic forms, GMO, sugar, or allergens like soy or corn. This is why I recommend whole food forms of vitamin C, which contain the full spectrum of vitamin C activity without GMOs or other junk. And my favorite whole food vitamin C product is Essential C from Paleo Valley. It's made with 3 of the most potent vitamin C rich superfoods on the planet, one of which is 120 times more potent than an orange. Nothing synthetic, no weird questionable ingredients, just food. Right now they're offering my community an exclusive 15% off discount. Just go to paleovalley.com/Chris and use the code Kresser15 to get 15% off. To live your healthiest, longest life, you need to understand what's going on inside your body. People age at different speeds, and generic annual blood work doesn't properly evaluate your biological age, but Inside Tracker does. Inside Tracker is a truly personalized nutrition and performance system designed to extend your health span and slow the aging process. Created by leading scientists in aging, genetics, and biometrics, Inside Tracker analyzes your blood, DNA, and fitness tracking data to identify where you're optimized and where you're not. You'll get a daily action plan with personalized guidance on the right exercise, nutrition, and supplementation for your body. Add Inner Age 2.0 to any plan to calculate your true biological age and see how you're aging from the inside out. For a limited time, get 20% off the entire Inside Tracker store. Just go to insidetracker.com/Chris Kresser. That's insidetracker.com/Chris Kresser.
Yeah, and I think another point to highlight is that the recommended intakes used from the original EAT-Lancet adequacy were from 1973. So they were far more dated than the what you're referring to, which of course, yes, many of the latest recommendations are still based on evidence that is quite dated. Yeah.
Okay, there's one more point I have to make, and then I promise I'll let this go. But it is the topic of the podcast, so we're not too far off on a tangent. And I'm curious if you ever about this, because I haven't seen any studies that look at this, and it seems mind-bogglingly complex to do so, but also very important, which is the concept of nutrient synergy. So we know that nutrients aren't just isolated from each other in our bodies. They have complex and often synergistic relationships. So we were just talking about magnesium. Let's use that as an example. That's required for the absorption and activation of vitamin D. So even if someone is getting enough vitamin D on paper, through diet or sunlight or supplements, if they are falling short on magnesium, then they will effectively present with a vitamin D deficiency, even though their intake of vitamin D is sufficient. Copper, similar. It's required for the absorption of iron. So if someone is copper deficient, even if they're getting enough iron, they can be iron deficient and even anemic. And I've seen that over and over in my practice, particularly with women who were not responding to iron supplementation or increasing iron in their diet. They were still anemic. We would test their copper, find that they were low, give them copper, and all of a sudden they would be their iron levels would go up. K2 regulates calcium metabolism. So if you're getting plenty of calcium but not enough K2, that calcium can end up in the soft tissues like blood vessels and kidneys and not get into the bones and the hard teeth and hard tissues where you want it. So to me, that's another big factor, because on paper, if someone's getting enough of certain individual nutrients, if they're low on other nutrients that are required for the biotransformation and activation of those nutrients, then they're still going to have a problem. And I'm not aware of any studies on nutrient sufficiency that even attempt to deal with that, given the complexity.
It's a great point, Chris. And I think it's another case for why we should aim to consume most of our nutrients through whole foods. I think there's a lot of reasons why, but that's another one. And, at the very least, be very mindful when we think about, which maybe we'll discuss, we think about other strategies like fortification or supplementation to really consider the synergistic effect of these nutrients.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so what in your mind, what can be done to, if you were to design a planetary health diet, let's put it a different way, how would it be different than what they've proposed?
I don't want the responsibility of trying to design a planetary health diet because
Yeah, that's a big task.
you're never also nobody's gonna say their diet and have oh, everybody will agree with you, right? Like people
Right.
are gonna criticize for all different reasons. So I'll sort of stay clear on the planetary side because, like you said, you talked about that.
Yeah.
I think it's reasonable to I think to push back on some of the modeling of the EAT-Lancet to say, look, maybe we can produce more animal source foods in a holistic way, using circular, diverse agroecosystems and produce more than what they propose. But I won't go there because that's a whole topic in itself. I will say there are many different approaches that we could use to sort of design a diet that is nutrient adequate and healthy. And I will also just kind of say for the EAT-Lancet diet, it was not proposing that everybody should consume this exact same diet. They do have ranges, and they did want to say like there's flexibility here, but I think we need to aim for higher nutrient density. So that would be one suggestion, and I think the way to do that would be to increase some of the types of animal source foods that are most nutrient dense, and of course being organ meats being very nutrient dense, shellfish, especially bivalves. And in general, I think it would, the diet would benefit from some increase in animal source foods. The current diet has about 14% of calories from animal source foods. So I mean, not thinking about the sort of environmental impact just solely on nutrient adequacy, I think increasing that is a sort of easy way to increase the nutrient adequacy because plant source foods and animal source foods have complementary nutrient profiles. And the lower you go in either food group, you have increased risk for trying to meet your nutrient needs. Now, I think when listeners may be saying, well, I can meet my nutrient needs on a vegan diet, or I can meet it on a carnivore diet. I don't have any issues. What I'm thinking about is at the population level, it's very difficult for most people to meet their nutrient needs. And so what we need to do when we're thinking of public health is to be promoting diets that are very protective of those concerns, increasing nutrient density in general. The other aspect that I think we already discussed is to reduce the amount of phytate. Now, phytate can have benefits, and I've heard sort of arguments for why you don't want to reduce phytate too much. There can be health protective effects of some phytate. So I think it's more about moderation, though. I don't think we need 2,000, 2,500 milligrams of phytate in our diet to have any benefits. And we know that really hinders the bioavailability. So whether that's reduced through the processing or, consuming foods, there's a bit of a variation between different types of legumes, nuts, seeds, and whole grains that are higher or lower in phytate. So choosing ones that are lower in phytate, I think can be a benefit. And there's also breeding strategies. There's a strategy called biofortification where it actually allows agronomists to change the nutrient content of the crops to adjust the amount of phytate. Again, you don't want to take it all out, but you can actually do that in the breeding process, and that is being done more and more. And I think that's a good strategy. There are other strategies, and I think it would be not efficient and not effective to only pursue dietary change or to try to have everybody in the whole world consume a perfectly healthy diet, because we know that there are many barriers to people having access to all of these diverse foods. We think about affordability as a big one, and animal source foods are generally more expensive. Now, not always, but they're often more expensive. So there's some challenges with affordability and people having access to safe foods, having access to refrigeration to store foods, right? Fruits and vegetables are actually not always accessible in many low and middle income countries. So when you think about worldwide, the issues around access and whatnot, I think we have to consider all sorts of different strategies that we can use. And another one of those is fortification. So staple foods like you can use grains. It can be whole grains, oils, whatnot. Salt is fortified with iron. It could be fortified with other nutrients as well. I think we need to work on fortification in a smart way, really as a safety net for when we can't have when populations can't consume all of their nutrient requirements through foods. We can make up for that in fortification. And I know, like the caveat, like you said, it doesn't adding a few nutrients is not making up for the diverse food matrix of foods that contain lots of these nutrients in synergistic ways, but it can really help fill nutrient gaps for people, and it can be done in cost-effective ways and with minimal environmental impact. So I think we need to pursue that. And I mentioned biofortification. This is really, I think, something that we need to pursue in terms of scaling up, so that the food that we consume, the crops that we consume, are as dense as they can be in nutrients. Now, when we started breeding crops in the agricultural revolution to really increase yields, to increase sugar and starch, it had a negative effect on the nutrient density of those foods. And now we're starting to pay attention to that. I think we need to scale up the breeding of crops. Now, this is something, it can be something as simple as using an orange flesh sweet potato compared to a white flesh sweet potato, which the dominant varieties of sweet potato, for example, in Africa, are actually white flesh. So there are already efforts in place to work on developing varieties that contain orange flesh sweet potato. It's actually, they're higher in vitamin A, they're higher in folate, and that can make a real difference, especially if those can be scaled up. And the fourth thing I would do is focus on supplementation when needed. And that's, providing concentrated nutrients either consumed through a pill or through a powder or even in lipid-based nutrient supplements. These can be really helpful for populations with increased needs. So pregnant, lactating women, young children, they can be consumed where you add them to food. And really those are effective ways of increasing nutrients, but they all have limitations. There's there can be side effects with supplements. You don't want excess, for example. You don't want excess iron, obviously, which can happen in a supplement form. But I think all of these strategies are important, and the reason is because no single strategy can be enough to make sure the whole population in the world can actually get the nutrients they need. So I think we have to be smart and try to do as much as we can to provide access to all of the populations who may not have access to, diets that ultimately would provide all of the nutrients required through the inherent or an intrinsic nutrient density in the foods themselves.
That's really fascinating. And I agree with all of that. I think there's a lot we can do to shore up our nutrient status, even in our existing food system. And, a lot of the conversations I've had with you before, and also with people that are working on this more from a food production perspective, regenerative agriculture and farming, which will produce much more nutrient dense foods, and making changes to the food system overall is going to be a big help. And I also appreciate the distinction you made between what's possible on an individual level and what is likely on a population-wide basis, which is what public health is concerned with. And this comes up in research studies as well. It's if you do a study on a particular dietary approach and the compliance is horrible, then in that study, the results will often be presented as a failure. And you might have an individual say, well, what happened to those 5 people that were able to stick with that diet, for 2 years? Well, they actually had pretty good results. So yes, from an individual perspective, it's possible that results, and likely, certain even, that results will vary, from person to person. But when you're talking about what is a good general recommendation to make on a population-wide basis, you have to take into consideration the people's typical behavior, unless you have some magic wand that is going to somehow change that behavior when you introduce your recommendation, because that's just the reality of the situation.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And behavior change is hard. And it's not easy to change the demand for foods. People want certain foods because they're desirable for many different reasons. I think to your point, we looked at what, based on the current sort of diets, when you look at the food supply, so all the foods available for consumption at a country, at the national level, based on existing diets, so what people are currently eating, we really see that when animal source foods get below 30% of the calorie supply, you start to see a lot more micronutrient inadequacies. And that's just pretty clear. And that's to your point about what people are actually going to consume when they have choices, when they have enough money to buy what they want to buy. We have to consider these factors. Not everybody's just going to buy the most nutrient dense foods possible, right? So it's an important consideration. I think you were correct to say that there's a big difference between the public health recommendations and what may be possible for an individual who's very health conscious, who listens to health podcasts and reads about it and makes sure that their diet is top notch.
So I know when you published this paper that was raising some concerns about the EAT-Lancet planetary health diet. Not surprisingly, the authors of that paper and probably didn't agree with some of your assessments. And I think Walter Willett is submitting a letter to the editor, and David Katz published a LinkedIn article with some objections. So I'm just curious what those were and how you would respond to their response.
Yeah, so I'll say first off that I had been discussing with Walter along, like, as I was creating this analysis. We sent a draft of the paper before we even submitted it, and he provided feedback. So it's been friendly. I really actually admire the ability of Walter and Walter Willett and David Katz to engage in really constructive, respectful dialogue. So we have some differences, but it's not like we're worlds apart. And I think it's really important to just highlight that these types of discussions are really important and essential for science. I think the media and social media aims to polarize these issues, and I think there's actually more in common than there is that we disagree on. But yes, there's some disagreements, and I think in the letter which Walter sent to me, he's going to submit. I think there's valid points, and we're going to respond, and I think we'll have a lot of agreement about that. But ultimately, I think there's still some disagreement about, like you mentioned, what are the recommended intakes and what should we be aiming for with these diets. And I think it's important to whatever diet, whatever diet we promote, I want it to be nutrient adequate, and I don't want to take a lot of risk on that because I see how widespread deficiencies are. So I think that's just something that I would want to maintain and be able to advocate for throughout this process.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I wish there were more venues and forums for these kinds of respectful and informed discussions. I won't even necessarily say debate. I mean, it could be a debate, it could be a discussion. I recently listened to a discussion about the future of AI and the impact of AI between Stuart Russell, who is really kind of literally wrote the textbook on AI, and then I can't remember the name of the second. His first name was Gary. I can't remember his last name, and it was completely different context, of course, AI versus health and nutrition. But I was struck by just how valuable it was to hear two experts that really respected each other and listened to one another while they were talking and actually took in what the other person was saying. And in one case, I sort of listened to one of the experts change his mind in real time based on what he was hearing from, the other person in the discussion. And my main takeaway from that was, wow, why doesn't this ever happen in the world of nutrition? It seems like there's just so much more vitriol and polarization and name calling and ad hominem arguments and, almost to the point of like a religious debate or discussion where it just starts to go beyond even just the data and the facts and turn into a more of a belief or agenda driven thing. So I hope that we can have more examples like this of people just really working together to find a solution that's in everybody's best interest.
I hope so too, and I will say there are a lot of healthy discussions going on behind the scenes. I know because I've been a part of many discussions where it is productive, it is constructive, it is respectful, and I don't think the public is seeing those, right? Because those are happening over email. That's happening in comments to paper revisions to meetings. I'm on papers all the time, with many of the EAT-Lancet authors, for example, and we have some disagreements, some discussions, some debates. That's good. That's healthy. That's important. And I think the more we can have scientists with different perspectives work together, I think the work that is going to be produced is going to be much more balanced because we all have biases. We all need to have them challenged and checked in a respectful way because we learn from them. I've changed my position through writing papers. Another researcher who I really respect is Christopher Gardner, who wrote a paper recently on animal source foods, and he's been on a mostly plant-based diet for decades, and we have some different views. But I was sort of impressed by the fact that we could really agree about most things and recognize that there are different approaches. There are many different approaches to a healthy diet. Some of the biggest things to address we can agree upon, like let's really address these ultra processed foods or the junk foods, and try to have a more wholesome, minimally processed diet. So I think probably it looks, because on social media and other public forum, there is just, I think, an incentive to be critical or polarizing, but there is quite a bit that goes on among scientists in these discussions. I think what people will also see is that there are these formal processes of writing a letter to the editor and then having the authors respond. I think that's helpful too, but we just need a lot more of this type of I think productive discussion between scientists.
100% agree with that. So what are you working on next?
So there's
Can you tell us, or do you have to kill us afterwards?
no. So really, my organization Gain works on trying to do programs and interventions to change the food system, the food environment, so that people can access healthy foods. So I'm working on some projects to really help guide those programs and also try to quantify nutrition more accurately, more appropriately in environmental impact assessments. So that's another topic I'm interested in. You can sort of see the many studies that look at what are the greenhouse gas emissions of each food that's produced, right? And I think that there's a more holistic way to look at that. Part of that is through looking at the food more terms than just kilograms or calories or whatnot. And so working on some efforts to try to quantify that in I think more holistic ways, and ultimately I'm sort of open to any sort of projects that I can be a part of that help advance this sort of what I would say my agenda of trying to improve access to healthy diets for everybody. So yeah, I won't go into all the details, but I really enjoy working with people who are trying to be constructive and productive as opposed to sort of debating to try to win an argument. And those are sort of the projects that I'm pursuing and working on now.
What a relief. That sounds like much more fun than the alternative. And I definitely applaud the work you're doing. I think it's really important. As you know, I think the nutrient deficiency and nutrient density issues have become primary for me. After 15 years of treating patients and training thousands of healthcare practitioners in 50 countries worldwide and seeing lab results from all over the world and my research on these topics, I've become convinced that addressing nutrient deficiency and aiming for, increasing nutrient density of every bite of food that we put into our mouth is the rising tide that can lift all boats. It's not to say that it's a panacea and that, that's going to solve all of our health problems. That's, of course, ridiculous. but I think it's one of the few things that we can do that we know will have a positive impact on just about every health condition that we suffer from at this point. They're almost, whether you're looking at heart disease or metabolic dysfunction or depression or dementia and Alzheimer's or hormone imbalances, all of those are characterized by some degree of nutrient deficiency. And, unlike big, gnarly issues, at least in the industrialized world, like environmental toxins and the global food system and things like that, increasing nutrient status is relatively low-hanging fruit. I mean, the work you do worldwide, that's a tougher goal, in developing countries, particularly, I imagine. But in the West, in the wealthier industrialized countries, it seems to me that just even some small steps towards increasing the nutrient density of diet could go a very long way in improving people's health. And so this has become sort of a legacy issue for me because, it doesn't require seeing a functional medicine clinician one-on-one and paying thousands of dollars for that and for lab testing. It doesn't require anything fancy, really. It just requires a more nutrient-dense diet, and in some cases, maybe some well-targeted supplements, and that can make an enormous difference in individual health and also in public health.
I find that so striking, Chris, that in working in the context of the U.S., I know you work with other patients, but in the U.S., where obesity and other non-communicable diseases are very high, you still see a significant role for addressing micronutrient deficiencies. And I think that's an important takeaway because that's not the narrative you hear in many public health messages, right? You don't hear we should be concerned with nutrient adequacy and nutrient deficiencies in the US or other high income countries, but I don't think that's true. I think it's clear from the data that there really are some important gaps, and it affects not just the undernutrition, but the relationship with other non-communicable diseases, like you pointed out.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ty, for joining us again. I know you're pretty active on Twitter. Is that the best place for people to follow you and stay up to date with your work?
Yep, I post the latest things I'm working on Twitter. My handle is Ty R Beal. It's TYRBEAL. So please check it out, and I'll be happy to engage there as long as it's respectful.
Yeah, exactly. No hating, please. Yeah, and then the other piece of that, of course, is personal ad hominem attacks are not very persuasive, right? It's just like if you want to argue with something that has been published in the literature, publish something yourself or make a constructive argument using data that's actually supportable rather than just slinging mud and calling names, which is not very persuasive at all for those of us that are paying attention. So again, thanks for your work, Ty. Thanks everybody for listening. Send your questions to chriskresser.com/podcast question. We'll talk to you next time. That's the end of this episode of Revolution Health Radio. If you appreciate the show and want to help me create a healthier and happier world, please head over to iTunes and leave us a review. They really do make a difference. If you'd like to ask a question for me to answer on a future episode, you can do that at chriskresser.com/podcast question. You can also leave a suggestion for someone you'd like me to interview there. If you're on social media, you can follow me at twitter.com/chriskresser or facebook.com/chriskresserlac. I post a lot of articles and research that I do throughout the week there that never makes it to the blog or podcast, so it's a great way to stay abreast of the latest developments. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you next time.